200 guests were watching Ethan Bell say the most important words of his life. And none of them noticed the photographer step half an inch closer than professional distance allowed, lean toward the groom's ear, and whisper 11 words that would stop the wedding cold. Don't marry her. Look at her phone. It's in her bag. Ethan's mouth was open mid-vow. The officiant was mid-sentence. Camille Reyes stood across from him in white, radiant, waiting for him to finish. And Ethan Bell, 31 years old, 3 months into an engagement that had felt, until exactly 4 seconds ago, like the best decision of his life, went completely, visibly still. Nobody in that garden knew what had just been said to him. His mother, seated in the front row in pale blue, assumed he was simply overcome with emotion, the way grooms sometimes are. Camille's father, standing close enough to see Ethan's face, but not close enough to hear the whisper, felt the first small flicker of unease, without understanding why. And Camille herself, watching her almost husband's expression change from adoring to ashen in the space of a single breath, felt something in her chest drop the way it does right before you already know, on some animal level, that whatever comes next is going to hurt. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness has no rank and grace wears no uniform, please like this video, subscribe to The Overlooked, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again today. The photographer's name was Daniel Marsh, 36 years old, and he had taken this particular wedding. Job through a booking system that had matched him to the Bell Reyes wedding 4 months earlier, based entirely on availability and a portfolio review, with no indication anywhere in the process that he had any connection whatsoever to the bride. Daniel had built a modest but respected wedding photography business over the 8 years since he'd left a career in corporate accounting, a career he'd abandoned not out of dissatisfaction with the work, but because of something that happened to his younger sister. Rachel, 9 years earlier, an engagement to a man named exactly the kind of confident. A charming figure that photographs beautifully at every event. A man Rachel had trusted completely and who had, in the final 6 weeks before their own wedding, drained nearly $40,000 from accounts Rachel didn't know he had access to, disappeared 2 days before the ceremony, and left Rachel not only financially devastated, but so thoroughly shattered by the public humiliation of an empty altar that she had, in the years since, retreated from most of the relationships and ambitions that once defined her. Daniel had never fully processed his own guilt over not seeing it coming. He had met the man a handful of times, found him perfectly pleasant, had even, in an unbearable irony he thought about often, taken engagement photos of the two of them 3 weeks before the wedding was supposed to happen. Photos that Rachel could not look at for years afterward. He had spent the better part of a decade since then developing, without ever naming it as such even to himself, an acute, almost involuntary sensitivity to the small behavioral signals that had been present in his sister's fiancé all along, and that nobody, least of all Rachel, had known to watch for. He had noticed something similar in Camille Reyes. Over the 4 months of wedding preparation leading up to this day, it had started small. The way these things always do, a phone that never left her hand during their engagement session, angled protectively away from Ethan, even in casual moments. A habit which Daniel had observed during 3 separate pre-wedding photo sessions, of stepping just out of earshot to take certain calls, always followed by a return to the group with a smile calibrated slightly too carefully back into place. At the rehearsal dinner 2 nights before the wedding, Daniel had been photographing candid moments from a discreet distance, the way good wedding photographers learn to become furniture in a room, and had caught, entirely by accident, a text notification lighting up Camille's screen while her phone sat face up on the table beside her wine glass, a name that was not a bridesmaid, not a vendor, not anyone Daniel recognized from 4 months of documenting this couple's life, paired with a message preview that read, in the brief half-second before Camille snatched the phone away, something about missing what they had and needing to talk before Saturday. Daniel had said nothing that night. He told himself, the way he suspected everyone around his sister had told themselves 9 years earlier, that it wasn't his business, that a single text message proved nothing, that he was a photographer hired to document a wedding, not a private investigator hired to interrogate a bride's fidelity, He had gone home that night and not slept, turning over the specific shape of the guilt he still carried about Rachel, the particular unbearable knowledge that he had seen small signs and said nothing, and watched his sister walk toward a devastation that a single honest conversation might have prevented. He decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn on the wedding day itself, that he would not carry that same silence twice. The dark part of what followed happened in real time, in front of 200 people, in a way Daniel had never planned and would spend considerable time afterward wishing he had handled differently. Even as he stood by the necessity of what he'd done, he had intended walking into the venue that morning to find a quiet moment before the ceremony, to speak with Ethan privately at Groom's dressing room, hallway, anywhere away from the ceremony itself. But wedding mornings move fast and are rarely private, and Daniel found himself, camera in hand, documenting the processional. Watching Ethan's face light up as Camille appeared at the end of the aisle, watching the entire arc of a wedding barreling toward its vows with no natural pause left for the conversation he needed to have. He made the decision, in the final seconds before the officiant began the vows, that a whispered warning during the ceremony itself, however disruptive, was less cruel than watching Ethan complete those vows in ignorance of something Daniel could not, in good conscience, let him not know. He stepped forward under the pretense of adjusting his angle for a photograph, a movement wedding photographers make constantly throughout a ceremony, entirely unremarkable to everyone watching, and leaned in close enough to Ethan's ear that only the groom could hear him. He said the 11 words. He stepped back into position, and then, for what felt to him like an eternity, but was in reality perhaps for seconds, he watched Ethan Bell's entire face change. Ethan did not finish his vows, he said to the officiant, in a voice that had gone strange and unsteady. I need a minute, in the garden, which had been holding its breath in the particular reverent silence of a wedding at its emotional peak, erupted instead into the confused murmur of 200 people watching something go visibly. Unmistakably wrong, Camille said. Ethan, what's happening? And the fear in her voice was real. Whatever else about the moment would later prove complicated. Ethan turned to her and said, quietly, so only the closest rows could hear, is there something on your phone I need to see? The color left Camille's face so completely and so fast that several guests would later say it was the first moment they understood, before anyone explained anything, that whatever was happening was not a misunderstanding. She said, what are you talking about? The specific brittle tone of someone buying time rather than someone genuinely confused. And Ethan, watching her say it, felt something in his chest that he would later describe as the exact sensation of a floor giving way, what Camille's phone actually contained. Once the ceremony was paused, once the two of them retreated with her maid of honor and Ethan's best man to a small side room away from 200 increasingly bewildered guests, was a 6-week exchange of messages with a former boyfriend named Ryan. Messages that had begun, according to Camille's own account, once she finally spoke honestly, as an accidental reconnection through a mutual friend's social media post, and had evolved, over the weeks leading up to her own wedding, into something Camille herself did not fully know how to categorize, not quite an affair in the physical sense, but an emotional entanglement conducted almost entirely in text messages that included, in the exchange from 3 nights before the wedding that Daniel had glimpsed at the rehearsal dinner, a message from Ryan that read, I still think about what we had. And are you sure you're making the right choice? And a response from Camille that read, I don't know anymore, followed immediately by, I have to stop this. We can't keep doing this, Camille told Ethan in that side room, with her makeup running and her hands shaking, that she loved him, that she had never physically been unfaithful, that the messages with Ryan represented a moment of doubt and old feelings resurfacing that she had genuinely been trying to end on her own terms before the wedding, not something she had planned to hide forever. She said she had been afraid to tell Ethan because she was afraid of exactly the reaction currently unfolding around them, a canceled wedding, a public humiliation, a version of events that made her look far worse than the complicated, confused truth actually was. Ethan, for his part, sat with his head in his hands for several long minutes before he said anything at all. He said eventually that he did not know yet whether this was something they could recover from, that the specific damage was not necessarily the messages themselves, but the 6 weeks of silence and performance that had accompanied them. The version of Camille who had continued planning centerpieces and dress fittings and vows while carrying on a separate, emotional life she'd deliberately hidden from him. He said he needed time, real time, not a wedding day decision made under the pressure of 200 waiting guests. To understand what he actually felt once the shock wore off, the wedding did not happen that day. Ethan and Camille emerged from the side room separately. First Ethan, who asked his best man to help him quietly inform the guests that the ceremony would not be continuing. Framed with as much dignity and as little public detail as possible, and then considerably later, Camille, who left through a back entrance with her mother rather, then faced the garden full of people who had watched her almost marriage collapse in real time. Daniel. Marsh spent the following week in a state of genuine uncertainty about whether he had done the right thing. A doubt that only deepened when Ethan called him 4 days later. Not to thank him, not yet, but simply to ask why. Why had a photographer he'd met exactly 4 months earlier, hired through an app, taken it upon himself to intervene in the most private moment of a stranger's life? Daniel told him about Rachel, about the empty altar 9 years earlier, about the small warning signs he'd noticed and said nothing about because it wasn't his place, about the years of watching his sister rebuild a life she should never have had to rebuild from that particular kind of devastation. He said, "I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever saw something like that again, I wouldn't stay quiet just because it wasn't my business. I know I handled it in the worst possible way in front of everyone, and I've thought about little else since Saturday. But I couldn't watch you make vows to someone while carrying information I already had that might have changed your answer." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I don't know if I'm grateful yet. I think I might be, eventually. Right now, I mostly just feel like my whole life got rearranged in front of 200 people I have to see again at Thanksgiving," Daniel said. "That's fair. I'm not asking you to feel grateful. I just wanted you to understand it wasn't cruelty. It was the opposite of what I let happen to someone I love." 6 weeks later, Ethan reached out to Daniel again. This time to ask whether he'd be willing to meet in person, not for photography, but because Ethan had spent the intervening weeks in the specific difficult work of deciding what he actually wanted, therapy sessions and long conversations with Camille that had ultimately ended, mutually and without further scandal, in the couple choosing not to reconcile. A decision Ethan described to Daniel as painful, but once the initial shock faded, undeniably correct for reasons that went beyond the messages themselves and into a pattern of avoidance and secrecy he realized, in retrospect, had been present in smaller forms throughout their relationship. They met at a coffee shop. An ordinary, uneventful meeting between two men who had been connected by one of the strangest afternoons of both their lives. Ethan said, "I wanted to ask about your sister. Is she doing okay now? 9 years is a long time to carry something like that," Daniel said. "She's doing better than she was. She started dating again about 2 years ago, slowly. She still doesn't love weddings much, understandably. But she's building something real, finally, on her own timeline." Ethan said, "I keep thinking about the version of this where you say nothing, where I make those vows and find out 3 weeks later, or 3 months, or God knows when, the way I assume your sister found out." He paused. "I don't know how to thank someone for costing me the wedding I thought I wanted in order to save me from the marriage I actually would have gotten." Daniel said, "You don't have to know yet. Some kinds of gratitude take a while to catch up to the moment that earned them." A year later, Ethan Bell was in a new relationship, one built, he told people when asked, with a considerably higher bar for honesty than he'd known to set the first time. He kept tucked into his wallet a small printed photograph Daniel had taken that day before the ceremony fell apart. Not the wedding photo that never happened, but a candid shot from earlier that morning, Ethan laughing at something off camera, unaware of everything that was about to unfold. A photograph that had somehow, against every likely instinct, become the one Ethan valued most from that entire chaotic day. A reminder of the version of himself who had not yet learned the hardest lesson of his adult life and had, because of one photographer's decision to break his own professional silence. Been spared learning it the much harder way. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, would you want to know the hard truth before the vows, even if it meant the wedding never happened at all?